She is truly one of the most remarkable people that I am lucky enough to know. She's been on a non-stop national speaking tour since this project launched in August. So let's give a warm Washington, D.C. welcome to the one and only Nikole Hannah-Jones.
What if I told you that the year 1619 is as important to the American story as the year 1776? That America is a country born both of an idea and a lie. I have been obsessed with the year 1619 since I was a high school student like you in this room. It was during high school when I was taking the one semester Black History course that my high school offered that I first came across a landmark book called Before the Mayflower. And on page 29 of that book is when I first saw the year 1619, marking the arrival of the first Africans in the colony of Virginia. And historian Lerone Bennett, who wrote that book, said these words: "What seems unusual today is that no one sensed how extraordinary she really was. For few ships, before or since, have unloaded a more momentous cargo." And he is, of course, talking about the white lion on which those first 20 to 30 Angolians were brought and sold into slavery. Like most Americans, I was taught very little about the institution of slavery. Slavery, of course, explained the American presence of my family and all of the Black people I knew and saw. But like most Americans, I was largely taught that slavery was marginal to the American story. Slavery had to be mentioned because history books needed to be able to explain the Civil War. But even this oh-so-brief discussion relegated slavery largely to the backward South and assured us as Americans that slavery had little to do with how our country actually developed. I've been thinking about the anniversary of 1619 pretty obsessively for the last 2 years. I knew that this anniversary, this 400th anniversary, was going to pass in most American households with little or no notice, because most Americans actually had no idea that this was an anniversary at all. But they should, because this is the very reason that we exist today as a country. We would not be the country we were it not for slavery. So let's begin with the part that most of us kind of know, which is that it was the bodies and the labor of enslaved people who built the very wealth that made the United States possible. Slavery made the colonies wealthy, and that wealth gave the founders the confidence to declare independence from the most powerful nation in the world at the time. During the height of slavery, 2/3 of the world's cotton was coming from the United States and was being picked and produced by our enslaved ancestors. In fact, the value of the bodies of enslaved people was worth more than all of the railroads and factories in the nations combined. New York City's fate was so intertwined with the institution of slavery that New York City's mayor threatened to succeed during the Civil War because more than half of all the exports from the city was enslaved-grown cotton. The entire financial sector of Wall Street was built on the mortgaging, financing, insuring, and collateralizing of enslaved workers. Slavery was a product of both the North and the South. The second richest man in the country during slavery was a Rhode Island slave trader who single-handedly sent what would become millions of Africans from Africa into the Americas. The Industrial Revolution that we all learn about was fueled by northern factories spinning cotton grown by the enslaved in the South. Enslaved people cleared the timbers that allowed for cotton and rice and tobacco production and taught the colonists how to grow rice. They had an indelible impact on the nation's wealth, north and south, east and west. Enslaved people built the infrastructure of our country. They built railroads and streets and government buildings, including the White House and the Capitol building right here in Washington, D.C. They took the sketches that Thomas Jefferson drew on paper and translated them into the architectural feat that is Monticello. And it was an enslaved man here in America who introduced the science of inoculation to the colonists during a rising smallpox epidemic in the 1700s. But what is less understood and almost universally overlooked in the way that we are taught about both the institution of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans is the unequivocal role that Black people have played throughout our country's history, and that is that we have been the perfecters of this democracy. Because you see, when the Founding Fathers wrote our founding documents, the words that they wrote were false. When Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," he knew as he was writing those words that those words would not apply to 1/5 of the population of the country who was held in absolute bondage, and that those words would not apply to his own family members, including the children whom he'd had by an enslaved woman. Our country says that we were founded to be a democracy, but we were actually founded as a slaveocracy, and that we were a country that was run by the owners of human beings, and 10 of our first presidents were enslavers. But while our founders set up a decidedly anti-democratic constitution that denied voting rights to the majority of citizens, to women, to Native Americans, and to Black Americans, and that denied absolute rights to 20% of the population, Black people actually believed in those founding ideals, even when the founders did not. And they believed in them with an unmatched fervor and responded to those ideals by pushing and fighting for liberation and universal equality for all Americans. From the moment when Crispus Attucks, a man who himself was a fugitive from slavery, became the first person to die in the American Revolution, to Black Lives Matter protests now, it is Black people who have fought to make the ideals laid out in the Constitution a reality, and who have fought more than any other group for the common good of all Americans. It is during Reconstruction that we see public education being brought to the South. It is the fight and struggle of Black Americans to end slavery and then provide equal protection of the law and citizenship for every person in this country, and universal suffrage, and the first civil rights legislation that we finally began to see this country striving to represent the ideals of our Constitution. Yet despite fighting for these tremendous advancements for all Americans, 100 years later, after the Civil War, Black Americans were still struggling to achieve those rights for themselves. And so they launched this nation's second mass movement for civil rights. And the civil rights movement of the 20th century, of Black struggle and resistance, and the fight to turn this country into democracy, set the template for all other rights struggles: immigrant rights, gay rights, women's rights, disability rights. They all owe their legacy to the Black struggle for civil rights. And the civil rights victories Black people won ensured rights not just for themselves, but for marginalized people across the nation. And today, Black people fight still. We are the most likely of all groups to oppose the death penalty, to support a living wage and universal health care. Because Black people came here under unique circumstances. We were the only people in the history of this country who were forced to come to and be a part of America. We were completely severed from our native lands, our native tongues, our native religions and cultures. But as sociologist Glenn Bracey wrote, "Out of the ashes of white denigration, we gave birth to ourselves." You see, we're taught that we should be ashamed of our history, but there's nothing for us to be ashamed of, because enslaved people created themselves a new here, isolated from both our native lands and our forcible segregation from mainstream white culture. We actually created what became the only truly unique American culture. You could say that Black Americans are actually the most American of all. When the world hears quintessential American music, it is our voice that they hear. It is the unique style and avant-garde flair that came from enslaved people's determination to exert individuality in a system of chattel slavery that tried to share all sense of humanity that created this original American culture. Black naming practices, the things that we have been maligned for as people, are actually signs of resilience and determination to thrive in the most brutal circumstances. Black people, in order to justify slavery and our original sin, have from the beginning been treated as if we are a problem. But what if America started in this 400th year to finally see us as a solution? My grandmother, Arlena Tillman, was born on a sharecropping farm in Greenwood, Mississippi during the height of racial apartheid in this country. She never got a chance to live her dreams. She did what so many of our ancestors had to do. She did the work that Black women were allowed to have, which was picking cotton, and then when she moved up north, she worked as a domestic, cleaning white people's houses. She worked so that we might be here today and have the opportunity to do the things that our ancestors could not. And though many of our ancestors did not live to see this, we 40 million descendants of those enslaved in this country are a testimony. You all are a testimony to the resilience of our ancestors. This project, the 1619 Project, is above all an attempt to set the record straight, to reframe our historical narrative, and instead of marginalizing slavery and the contributions of Black Americans, we place them firmly in the center of American history. And we show them that every aspect of American life, from why we have so much traffic in Atlanta, to why millions of Americans lack health insurance, to the geography of our cities, or the brutality of our system of mass incarceration, to the very democracy itself, that almost nothing in American life has been left untouched by that decision in 1619 to introduce slavery into the colonies. We argue with this project that August of 1619 is our true founding year, and that Black Americans, as much as these alabaster men set in monuments all around this capital city, are actually this nation's true founding father, that is our legacy and heritage. And in doing so, we finally hope in this 400th year that the 1619 Project will force us to tell the truth about who we are as a nation and who we can be. And in doing so, that we will stop hiding from our sins, but confront them and work to make them right. In closing, I'm going to paraphrase Toni Morrison, a guiding light for our people who joined the ancestors earlier this year, when she said, "I stood at the border, I stood at the edge, and I claimed it as central. I claimed it as central, and I let the world move over to where I was." Black people have been treated as the bottom. We have been treated as a question, as a problem. But today, we are taking our rightful place as the center. We are placing those who have always been treated as the bottom, as the top of the American story. Because we were once told, by virtue of our bondage, that we could never be American, but it's actually by virtue of our bondage that we became the most American of all. I thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations. I know we're live streaming, but if you know me, which many of you do not, I'm gonna hope that you will all be respectful to the rest of the speakers who come out here today. This day is about all of you, and people worked really hard to put this together for you, and I hope that you will do all of us the respect of paying attention and not talking and laughing during the rest of the presentations. Before we move on, I want to say that it is an honor for us to bring the 1619 Project, the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. I was here for the opening ceremony 3 years ago, and from that moment, it was clear that this was one of the most important historic and cultural institutions in the entire country.